Alrighty, well, good afternoon, everybody. I think we're going to get started. My name is Eric Anderman. I'm at Ohio State, and I'm delighted to be chairing this session. I'd like to briefly introduce my co-presenters, and then we will get started. So I'll be getting us started. I'm a faculty member at Ohio State, and I have a wonderful group of graduate students who work on this project who will be speaking today, and I'll go in the order in which they are going to speak. Shantanu Tilak, Yvonne Alsop, Adriana Martinez, and Kimiko Cheng. All right, welcome. Well, what we're going to be talking about today is a project that we have been doing for the past year and we'll be doing the next 2 years, which is, we call the session Adaptation of a Sexual Health Curriculum as an Interactive Virtual Teaching Tool. And what we're really going to do is tell you the story of how we had this wonderful opportunity come upon us and got this very big grant and the opportunity to do work with literally thousands of adolescents, and suddenly COVID happened, and we had to deal with that in a pretty much a moment's notice. So to give you an overview, a larger project, this is called The Changing Landscape of Adolescent Health Equity and Access in Central Ohio. And this is a 3-year grant funded by the Department of Health and Human Services, Office of Population Affairs. And I point out, I'm the co-PI with 2 colleagues, Mary Kay Irwin and Sarah Bodie. And it's a joint project between Ohio State and Nationwide Children's Hospital. And I'm an ed psychologist. Mary Kay is the director of school health at Nationwide Children's Hospital and for the city of Columbus. And Sarah Bodie is a pediatrician. And I point that out because we would never have gotten this funding for this project if it weren't for this collaboration. So people in ed psych, who I know this audience is, this is, I think, I've always been putting forth the virtues of really doing interdisciplinary work and working with others. And none of us would have gotten this grant alone, but together we were able to do that. So very briefly, what was this project about? This is a project where we are focusing on sex education for 7th and 8th graders. That is not typical because usually health education and sex education is in the 9th grade or later. So 7th and 8th grade is unusual. That's an innovation here. The other thing that we are doing in this study is that we have clinic access. One of our outcomes is we have clinics on site and mobile clinics at some of the schools. And one of the outcomes is trying to get these kids to actually use the clinics to for all of their medical needs, but particularly to be engaging in safe behaviors related to sex. We also have a component where we have peer ambassadors who are students who are in the schools who are sort of trained to be advocates for the program, to talk it up. It's an evidence-based program, and the design I'm not going to go into in detail, but we do have a 3-year experimental design. What we do is we manipulate different things over time. So it's a randomized control trial. We truly randomize, but we randomize some of the conditions. This on the far left, this SBHC, this is a site-based health center and a mobile health center, and schools that have no clinic. We couldn't randomize that because that's based on what the district we are working with actually has. But we do have a 3-year design. It's called a step wedge design, which is a really cool design that's mostly, it hasn't been used much in ed psych, but basically by the end of the study, everyone gets all the interventions. So it's kind of like a delayed control, but it's not quite the same. We have all 7th and 8th graders. We have 19 schools in this study. So 19 schools, all 7th and 8th graders, 3 academic years. That's a lot of kids we're reaching with this. And our hypotheses were, I've had other studies where we've done this work before, and we know that when this work is done well, it can improve kids' efficacy beliefs, their attitudes about waiting to have sex, their intentions to have sex can be delayed. We also are testing whether the peer ambassadors give any value added. There's a summer component, there's a parent component, there's lots of different pieces to this that we are testing. And we use a curriculum called Get Real, and we're going to talk quite a bit about that today. Get Real was developed by the Planned Parenthood of Massachusetts. It's evidence-based. It's endorsed by the Centers for Disease Control. It's comprehensive, aligns with national health education standards, which every state in the United States except Ohio has. I'm always embarrassed, but have to say that. Get Real is inclusive, it's trauma-informed, and it is basically designed for in-person delivery, all right? And it is, we'll talk about this, but it is very, very well researched. We know it works. It focuses on values, respect. It involves parent engagement. It acknowledges that learning about protecting oneself and sexual health is a lifelong process. And there are lots of things that get covered in here. And again, lots of material gets covered. There's lots of information, which is on the left, and students learn lots of skills. It's a skills-based curriculum. So they learn how, not just facts, but they learn how to refuse unwanted sex, how to make decisions, how to communicate with their peers and with their parents, etc. So there's lots of different things they get to do. And we aim this at middle school. That's what's innovative here. We call this is sort of the sweet spot for sex educational, because developmentally appropriate for this age group, but not done very often. Most programs are in 9th through 12th grade. But nevertheless, this is really probably where we should be intervening, particularly because at this level, it's mostly preventative. By 9th grade, a lot of kids have already been sexually active. 7th and 8th grade, some of them have, most of them haven't, so it's more preventive in nature. All right, and there was a little bit of guidance provided for doing this work online, but not very much. So, and we, when we wrote the grant proposal, we didn't think much about it. And then COVID happened. So this is going to be the story of how we adapted to that and what we did, having to deliver this curriculum suddenly online to about 2,000 kids in 19 schools. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Shantanu Tilak, who's going to start telling you that part of the story, which is more interesting than my part.
Thanks, Eric. Okay, so just to explain how we started and how this went on, there was an evidence-based curriculum that we started with, which is Get Real. And as Eric said, it's been used before with much success. We wanted to operationalize this for middle schoolers, but COVID hit. So we had to figure out a way to sort of increase interactivity and engagement for students online, because it's very hard to monitor what students are doing and hold them accountable for these things in classrooms, and also make sure they're getting all the resources that they need. So we wanted to make something that was more relatable and engaging to them. So what we did was we virtually adapted the evidence-based curriculum using the initial skeleton. And what we made was an evidence-influenced curriculum. So while it had some components from Get Real, most of them, we adapted the activities to fit within a virtual ecology. So there were a lot of handouts that were involved in this curriculum that students sort of had to fill out by paper. And of course, we couldn't do that because a lot of the kids were either online or in hybrid settings, and the landscape was just very diverse. So we decided to go virtual, of course, and sort of create all these activities online, embedded within the slides. We also added a lot of interactive visuals and graphics to the curriculum in such a way, as well as games and other skill-based sort of activities that allowed students to not only uptake the knowledge, but also create new knowledge together by discussing things in the classroom. So we sort of created this dual layered online ecology that engages both individual and collective pathways to learning. And that's sort of the goal of most computer supported collaborative learning theory in educational psychology right now. So just to explain, the flow of what happened, the curriculum team, which is the OSU research team, and the nationwide team as well, worked together over last summer. And we worked on the curricular skeleton that we had of Get Real, the initial skeleton. And we created a new skeleton with prompts for a web developer that sort of had explicit instructions as to what this person had to do to sort of create these interactive games for us. And that's what led to the creation of the virtual curriculum, or the outcome. So just to provide an example to you guys, the slide on the right is a very bare bones slide that we started with that asks students what postponement means. It basically means delaying something or putting it off until later. This was very simple, and it's very easy to get students to interact with you in a physical classroom. But since everybody's virtual and in their homes, there's a lot more distractions. So what we decided to do was make it more interactive, make it more relatable to the youths. So what we did was we gave explicit instructions to the developer in these notes that you see at the bottom, where we say, oh, you know, we want the question to pop up in an animation, and we wanted to adapt this to a sort of comic book strip where a teacher tells students that class is delayed or postponed, and they all have a reaction to it. So if you go to the next slide, you can see what it turned out like after our developer worked on it. So what we did was use a combination of stock images that were under Creative Commons licenses, a lot of smart text, animations that were created in graphic design software to create a lot of interactive games, which my colleagues will explain to you guys later. So yeah, I'll just hand it over to Yvonne to explain the different facets of the curriculum.
Thank you. So while we were creating this curriculum, we were quite concerned with student engagement. When we wanted them to, you know, this was important material, we wanted them to be engaged in the curriculum, especially in the virtual setting, which was new for them and new for us. So we needed a lot of increased interactivity with our activities themselves, with the slides themselves, between the teachers and the students. So we tried to create that through a use of various online tools, including Zoom, different features on Zoom that we can use, Google Classroom, Octog resources, which have a lot of great video resources to use. We use YouTube and a few other things as well. And as Shantanu mentioned, there was development of engaging visual material. So the web developer was really great to work with, and we were able to create relevant and modern graphics, including new things such as anatomy diagrams that were representative of the students in the study, the students who would be receiving all this material, animations of slides, and then virtual resources directly incorporated into those slides. We didn't want to leave the teachers hanging either, so we created a teacher's guide, a step-by-step how-to for them to follow, because ultimately the goal is for any old teacher to be able to pick up this curriculum and teach it to their students. So the training guide we created included instructions for the students, a prelude for them to give them a little bit of background material and what they're getting into, language and civility, meaning like some suggestions on how they might be able to talk about the sensitive material, to-dos for every lesson, lesson goals, agendas, and then a teacher script. So on this next slide, we have some examples of what one of these lessons looks like in particular from the teacher's guide. So this lesson is for 7th grade, it's reproductive anatomy, and as you can see on the left-hand side, there's an outline of goals and then pro tips, including language and civility that we put in there. There's an agenda included, and then as you go farther down, we aligned the teacher's guide with the PowerPoint slides. So there are instructions for slide 1, slide 2, slide 3, everything that the teacher might need to know. We gave them some tips about how to go about teaching the material, including various scripts of things that they could say word for word if they didn't feel comfortable doing it themselves. So in preparation for rollout, we created a lot of new material, so we needed a new set of eyes to look over things. We were able to get to double check the material and get some feedback on that. Facilitators were given the teaching materials, which included the PowerPoint slides and then the completed teacher's guide. And with all of that, with some of their feedback as well, we were able to check for lesson flow and make sure we had all of the material necessary. And we implemented necessary last minute changes that we had and provided a little bit more training to facilitators about how to teach in a virtual environment, because a lot of them, you know, had never done this before. It was something that was new for everybody in this situation. And so in doing that, we were able to get ready for the data collection. And this rollout process included the start of our pilot, where after everybody had received the materials, those facilitators we had who had been trained in Get Real were able to start things in 7th grade classrooms in 3 different schools that we had, all in a virtual environment. And with this, we were able to begin collecting data before and after the curriculum, and then again, get feedback about it before starting in all 19 schools in January of this year. So Kimiko and Adriana are going to give us some examples of what some of the different materials looked like.
Thank you, Yvonne. Really quickly, I'm going to share with you some artifacts of how we went about adapting the Get Real curriculum for the online classroom settings. So Shantanu, if you want to go to the next slide, please. Okay, great. So as you know, Get Real is an evidence-based curriculum, but it was definitely designed for being delivered in person. A lot of the content is delivered through hands-on in-person activities. Students are working together in small groups to fill out handouts, a lot of these things. We had to adapt for an online setting. And like Shantanu mentioned, a lot of it had to be delivered in a different context because in an online setting, just giving someone a handout in a Google Doc is not as engaging as it would be if you were in person. So some of our priorities when doing the adaptation was to support, use visuals to engage students, to create interaction in an online setting, and then have new forms of collecting anonymous questions and responding to them and providing access to resources on these. So here in this slide, you can see an example that our graphic designer created of visuals that are fun and engaging. They're kind of funny and silly. And we thought this was really important because the content in and of itself, it's a little sensitive. These are middle schoolers. It can be a little awkward. And it's even more so in an online setting where you can't necessarily be in person to create a safe learning environment. So creating visuals that both help communicate the content, that help students conceptually understand things like refusal, negotiation, but also creates a fun, welcoming environment in a virtual setting. In the next slide, we show an example. This is content that had it been delivered in person, it would have been in a handout. Students probably would have had some classroom discussions or worked in small groups to engage in this, but this is around pregnancy FAQs. As it would be delivered in a classroom in an online setting, the professor would click through these, a question would come up, and then the students would have a chance to respond. And Shantanu, if you click on the next slide, eventually the right response comes up. The professor has an opportunity to then clarify any misconceptions. And this handout then ends in the next slide with some visuals that just reinforce a key point of this activity, which is that any person that engages in vaginal sex can get pregnant if it's unprotected. In the next slide, we show how our team came together. We collaborated with the folks at Nationwide to brainstorm how we could visually communicate some concepts that are kind of tricky for middle schoolers to get. So one concept is the idea of gender being as a spectrum, or the idea of gender not being on a spectrum at all. So this visual here that we see in the upper left-hand corner is something that we came up with, and we handed off to our graphic designer, who then refined and developed this. And the one that you see on the right hand is something that we were like, we don't know how to visually portray this. And our graphic designer was like, I got you. Let me put some ideas together and see if you like it. And we thought it was a really great way of demonstrating this. And the next slide is also an innovation that came from our team, which is related to the levels of risk associated with different sexual behaviors. Again, had this been in person, this would have been a hands-on interactive activity, but instead we decided to use the analogy of a stoplight to help students associate different levels of risk with these types of behaviors. And this actually is accompanied by an online interactive activity that Kimiko is going to explain later on. The last example that I'll share in the next slide is this visual that we developed. Had it been done in person, students would have been given cards with the different steps for putting on a condom, and they would have worked together to arrange those cards or arrange themselves in the order that they thought would be appropriate. This would have not been feasible in an online learning environment. We considered doing things like Jamboard or Google Slides, but it wasn't feasible or practical given the constraints in which our instructors were delivering this content. So we opted for a visually engaging visual, and we paired it with a video that explains all of these steps, which we're not going to show you just for the sake of time. I'm going to pass it off to Kimiko to talk a little bit about the interactive parts of the curriculum.
Thanks, Adriana. So talking about online interaction, this goes hand in hand with some of those examples that Adriana just shared. A lot of these in person would be done with like a hand raise, or they would have note cards or a handout or a brief conversation, which with cameras on and off and students not necessarily wanting to unmute got really difficult online. So we had to come up with different ways for them to engage with these activities. One is a thumbs up, thumbs down. So students would be given a stereotype, and in a classroom, they might do a hand raise or talk about the stereotype. But online in Zoom, I think many of you might know, there's like a thumbs up or a thumbs down button that the students can use. And so that would be just as quick as a hand raise, and they could do that instead. Another example of this thumbs up and thumbs down are these agree, disagree. So students would be given an example of a situation. So this one is, if a friend or family member of mine was being harassed for being gay, I would intervene. And they could do a thumbs up if they thought they could intervene, or thumbs down if they weren't sure if they could, or if they didn't think that they would be able to intervene. And then they could have a discussion and a debrief about that. So it goes back to the stoplight activity that Adriana brought up. So we paired this with a Kahoot and a video and everything, and students were given the list of behaviors, and then they would rank them with the instructor into that red light, yellow light, green light based on the level of risk. Another one that they had is talking about definitions, and that can get boring online, not very engaging. In person, they might do a handout. In person, they might have them on a note card and run walking around the room, putting them on a whiteboard to match them. Instead here, they would get the terms on the left and the definitions on the right of the slide, and they'd work together with the instructor, and then they would match them with these lines to which one they thought was the right definition. And finally, in person, they would do some role play scenarios. They'd be given a scenario to kind of act out or to improv through. Online, that's a little hard. So instead, we worked with our designer and we developed these kind of comic book scenarios where they could read through the scenario, and we wrote this instead of having them improv it, and then they could debrief it afterwards and talk about what went well, what could have gone better, how each character in the role play acted, how it might have made the other characters feel, and what they might have done instead. And this is an example of that. And then we've been talking about these videos that we used through Oktalk and amaze.org, which are wonderful ways that are engaging, and they have characters that are kind of relatable for these students to walk through different situations and to walk through different concepts that might be more engaging via video instead of just a slideshow. And finally, we have anonymous questions. And in class, they would have had a box and they could have written down on a piece of paper, folded it up and put it in the box at any time. They passed it around the room. But online, obviously we don't have a box for them to put it in. So instead we created a Google form that the students could anonymously submit a question to at any time. And the instructors could go in and they wouldn't see any names, but they would see all the questions and they could go through them the next class period. And that's just a summary of that. And then for resources and support, it was really important to us that we were still able to give the students the resources that they needed. And so for each class period, they would get a slide at the end that talked about resources they could use related to that lesson. And then there was also a resource bank for all the students that had links and the slides and how they could get to the clinics and everything to make sure that they had all those materials that they could access outside of class.
All right, thank you. I'm just going to finish up and then we'd love to engage in some discussion with you all and hear from others about this. So concluding, what did we learn from this? Well, converting from an in-person to a virtual environment was a necessity. There was no roadmap for doing this. We were really in uncharted territory, not just with the technology, not just with the content, but with that combined together, and particularly because this is, again, content that it's not the easiest thing to talk about with kids. It's not the easiest thing for teachers to talk about. And with 6th and 7th grade, or 7th and 8th graders rather, it is the age group, it's particularly awkward for them. So we had to consider all of this in putting this together. And I can't emphasize, we didn't really talk a lot about principles of ed psych, but how much that I hope you realize how much of that was embedded in all this in terms of engaging students, in terms of their learning, in terms of them actually internalizing this material and being able to make use of some of these things when they are really confronted with a situation where they have to make a decision that could involve whether or not they're going to engage in a risky behavior. Collaboration across stakeholder organizations and strategic project management allowed for an accelerated timeline. We didn't have time to go into it, but we had a lot of, in addition to Ohio State and Nationwide Children's Hospital, we had wonderful partners in the community. There is an organization in Columbus called Celebrate One, which is a collaborative of organizations designed to essentially help to decrease infant mortality. And so we had a lot of community organizations who were helping us with this. The school system that we work with was very supportive. Piloting this was very important, and we actually were able to do that. We had to really get ahead of our schedule with the grant to pilot this because we didn't feel we could just develop this huge thing and then roll it out to 1,900 kids just like that. So we were able to do some piloting. I have to say that our funding agency, the Office of Population Affairs, they were very flexible with us. They understood, not all funders necessarily understand about doing things in school, but they were very sensitive to the fact that we were working with a school-age population and that school had been, was not the way we expected it to be, and they were flexible with us. And the other nice thing is after the transition back to in-person, all these online resources that we spent a huge amount of time and money creating are going to still be used. They're going to be integrated into what's happening this year. So we're going into year 2 of this project starting in a couple of weeks, and we will be in 19 schools. We will be in the fall delivering this to all of the 8th graders in the 19 schools. We did all of the 7th graders last spring. So it is longitudinal in that sense. And the other thing I'll mention before I close is that there's a huge research component to this that we also had to deal with. And we're not talking about that here, but in addition to doing all this, we managed to get all of our data collection online, and we managed to collect data from 2 time points from these kiddos. I think about 1,000 kids roughly at baseline, and we were able to get follow-up data on about 600 or 700 of them, which we were very pleased with, given that attendance in classes was extremely sporadic, and we were doing this all in Zoom and Zoom rooms, but we were able to still pivot the research component and get really, really wonderful data. This fall, we're going to be this is going to be done all the kids are back in school. It's going to be done face-to-face, barring any changes that may happen. So I'm going to stop there, and hopefully we can now engage in discussion through the chat. So thank you, and thanks to my colleagues, and we will leave it there. And I will read, there already is, there was a question, first question, how far sex education for 7th graders should be different from sex education for adults? I'm asking because my daughter's a 7th grader and refuses to attend a lot of information due to the possibility of being exposed to disgust. So the question is, how much should be different for younger kids? And wondering if I can actually call on Yvonne to maybe respond to this, because Yvonne has been a health teacher and has done some of this and been deeply engaged in it. And she can be mad at me later if I picked on her and she didn't want to answer it.
Yeah, I can take a stab at that. A lot of people have varying opinions about what to teach to students of different ages, especially middle school students, about sex ed and human anatomy and reproduction and all that that means. And the great thing about Get Real is that it's skills-based, and not only does it teach about those topics that I mentioned, but it teaches about different things, including respect in relationships, refusal skills, how to say no. And again, you're going to get a lot of feedback with a lot of different opinions about what you should teach at these ages. But in my professional experience, I've just found that if you can find things that are developmentally appropriate, where you are open and straightforward with students, they are very appreciative of it. And they have a right, just as everybody else, to learn about their bodies and the changes that are going to be happening, and that many of them are already experiencing. So things that would be considered age appropriate, you don't have to go into graphic or explicit detail about a lot of things, but just being open and honest about them, about what about the topic, because it's a part of normal everyday life.
What I've found, I've been doing this kind of work for quite a while now, and have had a bunch of other projects where we've done this. And what we have found now with doing this with well over, I can honestly say, maybe 10,000 students in multiple states, is that the most important thing is the instructor. The instructor makes all the difference. And if the instructor is comfortable with the material and is comfortable talking about this, and knows adolescents and knows that this is difficult to talk about, and can handle it in a really a way that the kids can relate to, the kids will talk about it. The other thing we've found is that we have done this work. We're doing it in an urban setting now. In one of our previous grants, we did it in 38 different counties in Appalachia. And parents, for the most part, have been extremely receptive and want their kids to get this. In one of our previous projects, we had a grant, we were doing this in Appalachia and in sort of the middle of the Bible Belt, and we were worried that people would not want to do this. And we had, I want to say, like 90% or 95% of the kids participated, had permission to participate. The ones who didn't, it was probably mainly because they just didn't bring their consent forms back despite the incentives. There were very few who opted out and whose parents said, I don't want my kid to get this, which we have found repeatedly in different settings where we've done this. See, there's another question. Let me congratulate you on this project. What a big endeavor to undertake and then to have to go virtual. My question is, did your program tap any children that were also on the spectrum? If not, have you given any thought to add that population to work and adapt the material for those children? The quick answer is there absolutely were, but we don't know who they were, because that's part of that. We weren't authorized to collect that information, but our arrangement was that every child in the district in the 7th grade and the 8th grade, unless the parent would not permit it, would be exposed to this. So as long as those kids were in a regular classroom during the class where this was instructed, they did get that. In terms of adapting it, that is a wonderful idea, and that would be a phenomenal thing for us to be able to do in the future. So I'm sure we have those kiddos in our sample. We don't know who they are, unfortunately, and we won't, because we can't know that information. Let's see, there's another comment. Professionally, I'm a former medical educator. I used to teach 2nd-year med students communication skills to elicit a sexual history from a patient. Even in the arena of higher education at this level, it was difficult. Personally, I was disappointed the school district that I am in beyond impressed with what you all have developed. It is so needed in the population you are conducting your program and researching. Great job. I wish you all much success. Oh, well, thank you. I thought it was a question, but we'll take that too. Thank you. Somebody else said, sorry, personally, I was disappointed the school district in my area discontinued programs in sexual health to middle and high school students. And then another question is, what made that grade range your target? I had sex ed for the first time in 5th grade, and then every 2 years after with increasing detail. And I was very surprised to hear that 9th grade was typical. 9th grade does seem to be typical. What my observation has been, most kids get something in elementary school and it's pretty minimal. It's like they come and they have the boys have a little movie night and the girls have movie night, and they talk about stuff, and then they don't get much of anything again until the 9th grade. That's generally when across the United States it happens. There are exceptions to this, but 7th and 8th grade, that was part of when we wrote the grant proposal, was what we were proposing as being an innovation. It was, for the most part, it's not done with that age group. And again, one of the rationale that we use is that by the time they get to 9th grade, I mean, the data are, so 33 to 40% of ninth graders in this country have already had sexual intercourse. That is something that I heard before I did this research, and in every data set we have collected over 20 years now, we get that result. So that's very real. It's probably more than that. So mainly our reason for going at the 7th and 8th grade is because that's the point, is let's try to be preventive. Let's try to, before this happens, give kids the tools that they need to be able to make decisions that they need to make about these things. What Eric is talking about is sometimes referred to as maturation programs. State and local policies also pose limitations in how we can teach sex ed. So that's a whole, I mean, there's a whole, I'm very interested right now to see how we're going to be affected this fall, because there are so many things going on right now with schools and school systems worrying about what is being taught. And I'm sure you can just turn on the news and hear about particularly conversations about race and about what's being taught in schools regarding race. And in terms of sex and what's being taught with sex, most of the time there is, if it's just done as part of the regular curriculum, parents don't start to question that. But there's been a sort of organic grassroots movement of parents really trying to police what teachers are teaching to students. So we are hopeful that that is not going to affect what we are doing. And again, we're using a curriculum that is tried and true, and that the curriculum does not teach kids to have sex. It teaches abstinence, but it teaches decision making. And it acknowledges that not all kids are going to abstain. So it's very realistic in that sense.
Is this sex education culturally appropriate? I mean, can we incorporate it into the curriculum, for example, in Pakistani schools?
Great question. So has been designed to be culturally appropriate, and but that's kind of vague in some sense. And so there's clearly can be adaptation as needed for local context. I think, we did some adaptation in what we did. In terms specifically for Pakistani, I'm not sure if you're talking about within the United States or outside of the country. This is very much designed for the United States, and it's a US based. It could be certainly utilized in other countries, and we've done that in other studies where it's had to go through a major overhaul. So the people who put out the curriculum Get Real, they advertise it as being trauma informed, as being culturally sensitive, and I think it is to some extent, but certainly there are going to be things that need to be adapted and can be adapted. Wonder if any of the students on the panel who were involved in the conversion process have any examples of how that was done that you could maybe share.
Yeah, I mean, even as we were going through the Get Real curriculum itself and then adapting it for our circumstances, we were cognizant of the area in which we were working in, the middle of Ohio. There's a certain people have certain ideas about things and about how they should be done, especially when it comes to sex education. And so we were cognizant of that and wanted to be respectful of those ideas and these values that people hold, while still promoting good and accurate, medically accurate information as well.
And with regards to sort of incorporating the population that we serve, as Yvonne said, we catered this to Ohio, and there is a large minority population in Ohio as well. So I think we mentioned earlier how we adapted all our anatomy diagrams to be more culturally inclusive. They didn't only feature, Caucasian sort of features. We sort of adapted these to be indicative of, different populations that Ohio consists of, so that everybody feels included or that this relates to them, because we have to finally increase ownership over anything that you give to students so that they feel, that it's relatable to them. What else? Another example would be even gender, like the way Get Real talks about gender. We sort of altered that to include like the blob that speaks about the gender spectrum, because there has been a shift towards a lot of teenagers identifying with, non-binary genders today. And even with pregnancy. I think a lot of people, we worked with Planned Parenthood over the summer as well, and we were having these discussions with people at Planned Parenthood about how, you know, Get Real it tends to be very patriarchal in the way that it talks about pregnancy. So I feel like the way that we sort of disseminated the curriculum or distributed the curriculum sort of took a more gender equal outlook on pregnancy as well. So those are some of the possible adaptations that you could consider that we took. And with regards to sort of adapting this to other countries, of course, I feel like it would need, like I'm from India. So if we were to apply this to India, we would definitely have to adapt it to be more relatable to them as well. So to answer that.
In one of our previous studies that was completed over 15 years ago at this point, we adapted a different curriculum that was endorsed by the Centers for Disease Control to be used in South Africa. And we did it in South Africa, and it required a huge amount of work in order to adapt it. And that's another thing in this kind of work. You can't just take a curriculum like this one and just make minor tweaks to it. I can't emphasize enough how important the pilot work is, and getting feedback from the students and from people in the community, and really making sure, particularly if this is going to be used in a different culture, that it is appropriate, that it reflects the norms of that culture, and that it reflects the diversity of norms in that culture, because the diversity within our culture is enormous, and within any other culture. Just thinking about India, like you mentioned, if we're going to bring it there, I mean, it would need to be completely, you know, rethought of in so many ways. But that doesn't mean it couldn't be done. Doesn't mean it couldn't be done. The science behind it is still the same, but the way it is actually done for the kids is very, very different. One of the other things that we didn't really get to talk about, but I think it was Yvonne mentioned, we have this part called anonymous questions, which is when in each class students get to ask anonymous questions, and normally that's done by them writing it on a piece of paper, but we actually were able to do that electronically, to set up a system where they could enter their questions, and they could enter them anonymously. So they could ask things that they're embarrassed to ask and they want to ask in front of their friends, but they still want to be able to ask and not have it attributed to them. We did figure out a way to do that so that they truly are anonymous. And they were collected at the end of a class, and the instructors got them and were able to address them in the next class. And we have an enormous data set right now of anonymous questions that thousands of kids have come up with related to, and this is in addition to all our regular data that we usually collect, you know, a lot of survey data and data on the asking kids about what they would do in certain scenarios. But this anonymous question data, normally that would not have been data for us, because the kids just write it on a scrap of paper and the teacher collects it and reads it and throws it out. But because it was electronic, we were able to build that into actually our design of our study. And we don't know which kids wrote which one, because it's anonymous, and to truly be anonymous and not violate our IRB, we don't know. Nevertheless, we have an enormous amount of really, really wonderful data on that. So thank you all. Thank you for coming. Thank you to the panelists for being here.